Hey, this is Mr. Mitchell with another video. Today we're going to be talking about soil. Soil is made of four main ingredients. Four main ingredients you can see here are weathered rocks, water, air, humus. We'll go over what these are. Now, weathered rocks, it's kind of hard to imagine that soil here is primarily 75% composed of rocks that have just gotten very, very small and gotten to look like dirt, but it is. And if you think about it, you find every once in a while these little bitty pieces of rock. And I mean, how did they get that way? And they ended up being worn away by wind, by water, and this topsoil that we have, this soil that we have, is mostly weathered down rock. Another 20 to 30%, I guess weathered would be more 65 to 70%. 20 to 30% of what's in soil is actually water and air. Now that turns out to be essential for soil. You don't want soil, I mean, most soil that you come across is not like cheesecake. Cheesecake, you know, is very, very dense. The soil that you come across is much more, you could lift it up with your fingers and it'll fall through your fingers type of consistency. So you do find that 20 to 30% of the soil is water and air, and that's a good thing. Now we have a very important 5% that is something called humus. Now that's not hummus, which is something to eat. This is humus. And humus is going to be animal remains, plant remains, and, well, poo. Hey, who did that? That was uncalled for. Well, anyway, humus is very essential because if you have the better growing soil, you're going to have some humus in it. You may remember hearing that old-timey fertilizer was poo. And you put poo on the ground and it made it help grow crops. So better growing soil depends on the humus. It also depends on the kind of rock and the amount of water that happen to be in the soil. Now you have different visible levels in the soil, and if you take a look right here, you can see that we have a layer here, a layer here, and a layer here. And you see I already also have over here A, B, and C, and that's what scientists are classifying these layers as. Horizon A, Horizon B, and Horizon C. The main layers, well, the A is the topsoil. The topsoil, as you can see here, is usually darker. And the reason it's darker is because it has more humus in there. It also has more water, it has more air. This is the layer that would grow crops much more readily than Horizon B or Horizon C. The Horizon B has very little humus or organic matter. It is a little more brownish, reddish, not quite as dark at the topsoil. So you might can think of B for brown, brownish, reddish, whereas the topsoil is typically darker than that. And then you have level C. Level C is the largest, but it has the least weathered amounts of rock in there. In fact, if you were to get down in here and dig up this stuff, you would find more rock particles down in here than you would definitely find in the topsoil, and more than you would find in the next layer of soil, layer B. And layer C is generally yellowish. Now, this particular picture looks very good as far as having the three layers, but it all depends on where the layers are. I mean, in some parts of our country, you would have level C, for example, that would not be as yellow, or level A that would not be as brown, and so on and so forth. The term for the horizons in any specific location is called soil profile. That would be the horizons. I don't know what happened there. Well, I'm really messing up here. Let me see if I can get this back. Horizons in a particular location would be its soil profile. Here in Georgia, for example, we would have a different soil profile than, say, in Arizona. Here in Georgia, we grow crops a lot better, so our topsoil would probably look slightly different. Even our B and C layers would probably look a little bit different as well. Continuing on, what affects the soil profile? Things that affect the soil profile are things like climate. For example, our climate here would be different than the climate of the desert. And it also, the shape of the land would also affect the soil profile. And we'll get to the shape of the land in just a little bit. The climate that is most beneficial is going to be a tropical climate. Oh, my bad. It's not going to be a tropical climate. It's going to be a temperate climate. Happen to have a chart, a thematic map of the world, and we have temperate climates which are in the green areas. And the green areas would be the better farmland throughout the earth. And you can see it's not too close to the equator. It's kind of in a more temperate region. Now what happens in here when you have these tropical climates, they're not as good for soil. It's just too much rain, and you can see around the equator you've got all kinds of tropical climates, and they're not the best of place to grow farm goods. The more temperate climates are a little bit better. Now you probably can imagine that there are some desert type climates. You can't see this here, but it says dry. Northern Africa is very dry, and of course you're not going to grow very good farmland in the desert. We even have some dry areas here in the United States also that doesn't grow crops very well, and over here in Asia. And then the blue, of course, is going to be Arctic areas, and it's just so cold, like in northern Canada here and up in the northern part of Russia, that you're just not going to get very good farming. So the absolute best soil profile, or the best climate, would be the temperate. Not too hot, not too cold, makes for the best soil. A temperate climate. Another thing was mentioned, the shape of the land. The shape of the land is talking about whether it has mountains or valleys. Now I mentioned that where we live here in Georgia happens to be in this green area where it's supposed to be the best for farming. But there are parts of Georgia which are mountainous. The mountainous parts of Georgia will not be good farming. And you can imagine why. I mean, if you have soil like this soil right here on a mountain, every time you get wind, every time you get rain especially, it goes downhill. If you have topsoil on a mountain and you get all kinds of rain on the mountain, it's going to take everything downhill. Now the best parts are where it takes it to, and that's in the valleys. The valleys are much better for farming than the mountains are because of the water and the erosion taking the topsoil down into the valleys. Now let's talk a little bit about living things in the soil. There are plants in the soil. Now plants help loosen up the soil, and they provide humus whenever they die. When plants die, they are what's categorized as humus. So probably the biggest thing is that it loosens the soil. There are microorganisms in the soil that help decompose plants and add nutrients. And if you were to take a spoonful of soil, you could have as many as millions of microorganisms. And finally, there are animals such as ants, worms, gophers, and the things they do the best is loosen up the soil. I mentioned earlier that you don't really want your soil to be like cheesecake. You don't want your soil to be very, very thick. You want water and air to flow through it. And animals living in the soil, like moles and ants, they help loosen the soil up. So they provide their own little special part to our soil. We have soil textures. I'm not going to mention much about soil textures, but your book will have a graph where you see sand and silt and clay. These are the soil textures, and these are from largest to smallest, and there's a good diagram in our book. And soil that has 25 to 60% pore space is the best of soils. Now, what I mean by pore space, what in the world's going on here? Let me see what I can do to change this. Ooh, boy. I need to change that for sure. But anyway, pore space means areas that water and air can get into. So if the soil has 50% pore space, that's a lot of space inside this soil. Now this soil right up here, level A, is the best kind of soil because it's the top soil. It has lots of space, water can run through it, air can run through it, and 25 to 60% pore space is in fact exactly what you're wanting to have.